Tonight, the war in Ukraine has changed its axis. It has moved beyond the trenches and the slow, grinding counteroffensive, shifting instead to a brutal, deliberate campaign waged against the very existence of civilian life. This is not just news of another missile barrage. This is the calculated deployment of weaponized darkness, of manufactured winter agony. Russia didn't just launch a few drones as harassment. Moscow unleashed the single largest saturation attack since this full-scale invasion began. A vast, relentless swarm designed not to wound, but to kill the power infrastructure of an entire nation. And the results are in. The cold truth is that the assault succeeded in a way that ground forces could only dream of. Ukraine's electrical spine, the network of resilience painstakingly constructed over months, has just been fractured. The consequences are immediate, they are existential, and they are spreading across the frostbitten map of Eastern Europe right now. This is the moment when strategic failure hardens into a humanitarian catastrophe. This is when the lights truly go out, and the long, brutal calculus of survival takes center stage. We begin tonight with the numbers that define the scale of this new reality. They are not estimates. They are confirmed operational data released by the Ukrainian General Staff itself. Fact 1. Scale and weaponry. The assault was not a wave. It was a deluge. The Ukrainian General Staff confirms that over a relentless 36-hour period, Russia employed 458 of the Iranian-designed Geran 3 drones. This is the precise figure. 458. This number is critical because it marks the largest single saturation attack against deep infrastructure since the first shots were fired. This was not a randomized strike pattern. It was a sustained, complex operation executed in 3 distinct and punishing waves, each following the last with the cold, mechanical logic of a computer algorithm. Think about the sheer logistics of launching 458 drones. This speaks to a massive, successful replenishment effort within the Russian Federation, proving that sanctions and interdiction efforts against drone components have, at least for now, failed to cripple their long-range strike capability. This swarm demonstrates a strategic shift, a prioritization of long-range, cheap, destructive power over high-value cruise missiles. The Geran 3 is slow, it is noisy, but it is effective when deployed in such overwhelming numbers, flying low, overwhelming air defense crews already stretched thin across a 1,000-mile front. The goal here was volume. The objective was saturation. To introduce so many low-cost munitions into the airspace that even the most advanced Western air defenses, the NASAMS, the Patriots, become prohibitively expensive to operate against every incoming target. Russia is forcing Ukraine to exhaust its most precious, high-cost interceptor missiles against platforms that cost pennies on the dollar by comparison. The 458 figure is not just a tactical report. It is an economic weapon being wielded against the West's aid commitments. It's a message that Moscow can print destruction faster than NATO can deliver protection. This sustained 3-wave assault over 36 hours was designed for exhaustion. It meant air defense crews had no rest. It meant maintenance teams had no time to reload and recharge batteries. It meant a constant, pulsing threat hanging over every major city, forcing civil defense sirens to wail nonstop, draining the national spirit hour after relentless hour. This was psychological warfare wrapped in concrete shrapnel, delivered by the deadly buzzing sound of hundreds of cheap motors flying through the winter night. The sheer scale of this deployment demands that we reevaluate everything we thought we knew about Russia's capacity to wage this type of infrastructure war. It is not just about having the drones. It is about having the intelligence, the coordination, and the political will to commit this much ordnance purely toward shattering civilian quality of life. The 458 number will stand as a dark benchmark for the winter to come, defining the maximum destructive capacity Moscow is willing to commit to achieve total darkness. And that darkness spread quickly, finding its focal point in the most critical hubs of Ukraine's vast energy matrix. Fact 2. Critical infrastructure loss. The target was not random, it was surgical. While the drone swarm was vast, the strikes that penetrated defenses were directed with frightening precision. The national energy operator, Ukrenergo, confirmed an almost unbelievable level of destruction at one of the nation's most vital facilities, the Darnitsia thermal power plant in Kyiv. The damage confirmed was not a partial hit. It was the complete destruction of the primary switchyard. This distinction is critical. A switchyard is the beating heart of a power plant. It's where the massive electrical energy generated by the turbines is stepped up to ultra-high voltage. In this case, 750 kilovolts, for long-distance transmission across the country. Destroying the generators is hard. Destroying the 750 kV autotransformer and its key synchronization modules, which regulate the flow of power to the grid, is surgically destructive. Ukrenergo cited irreversible structural damage. This is the cold language of engineering failure. Irreversible damage means this facility doesn't just need a patch. It requires total reconstruction, sourcing specialized custom-built hardware, like a 750 kV autotransformer. That takes months, often a year, to manufacture and ship even in peacetime. This type of equipment is measured in hundreds of tons and complex specifications. The Darnitsia plant destruction is more than just a power outage for Kyiv. Darnitsia was a node of immense strategic importance, designed to feed power into critical military, logistical, and governmental command centers. Taking it out completely means crippling Kyiv's strategic depth, forcing the capital to rely entirely on far-flung, often overloaded, backup networks. This strike signals a chilling level of Russian intelligence preparation. They didn't hit the biggest building. They hit the most delicate, irreplaceable, and specialized component. They knew exactly which part of the circulatory system to sever to ensure maximum long-term damage. This isn't just about turning the lights off for a week. It is about permanently reducing Ukraine's national power baseline capacity for the remainder of this conflict and potentially years into the reconstruction. The irreversible structural damage at Darnitsia is the symbol of success for the Russian war planners. They have proven that their mass saturation strategy can punch through defenses and hit the single most important point of failure, achieving strategic goals with tactical strikes. This attack has reset the operational clock for Ukraine's energy security, pushing reliance back to the very basic, localized, and often diesel-fueled generators, which are costly, inefficient, and highly polluting. The destruction here is a physical manifestation of Russia's political will to impose suffering and collapse. But let us not ignore the other side of the equation. What about the defenses? What about the hundreds of millions of dollars invested in air defense systems provided by the West? Fact 3. Operational penetration. The paradox of the successful failure. Ukrainian air defense forces claimed an 81% interception rate. This is, on paper, a remarkable achievement. Out of the 458 drones launched, 371 were neutralized. The soldiers operating those systems performed heroically, defending population centers against a near-unprecedented wave. An 81% shoot-down rate against any coordinated aerial assault is typically deemed a successful defense. But the mathematics of infrastructure war are cruel. They do not tolerate moral victories. While 81% were stopped, the remaining 19%, a total of 87 drones, successfully penetrated those layered defenses. 87 weapons of destruction found their targets. And those 87 drones were not scattered randomly across empty fields. They were focused with surgical, terrifying precision. Their targets were primarily substations in 7 different oblasts, including major logistics and industrial hubs like Cherkasy and Odessa. This is the strategic paradox that defines this moment. Failure was not in the quantity of the drones intercepted, but in the quality of the strike plan. Russia accepted that 80% would be shot down, understanding that if they could focus the remaining 87 successful hits on key infrastructural pinch points, the outcome would be devastating. The energy grid is a complex web. If you cut power lines, you cause a local outage. But if you destroy substations, the critical nodes where high-voltage power is converted for local use and directed to communities, you take out entire regions. The substations targeted in Cherkasy and Odessa are vital components that service military logistics routes, port facilities, and major population centers, making the resulting blackouts strategically corrosive. The penetration of these 87 drones meant that even a seemingly successful defense resulted in strategic collapse. These were not random hits. These were carefully choreographed strikes following intelligence gathered over months, exploiting weaknesses in the layering of air defenses, hitting the gaps, and focusing exclusively on electrical systems rather than purely military targets. The 81% success rate feels hollow when 19% of the enemy's weapons managed to cripple 30% of the nation's power capacity. This leads us directly from the engineering failure to the human toll. Because when the lights go out, the war moves from the battlefield into every home, every hospital, every school. Fact 4. Humanitarian crisis. The cold is now the weapon. This assault has instantaneously plunged millions into a severe humanitarian crisis, amplified by the relentless march of winter weather. Emergency services have confirmed that 4.1 million residents across 3 major oblasts, Sumy, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv, are now under emergency blackout protocols. For 0.1 million people. That number represents entire cities suddenly rendered reliant on generators, if they are lucky, or plunged entirely into medieval darkness and cold. The timing of this strike is calculated and cruel. The weather forecast provides the devastating context. Temperatures are expected to drop below -15 degrees Celsius within the next 72 hours. -15 degrees. This is not just uncomfortable cold. It is life-threatening exposure. For 4.1 million people, the loss of centralized power means the loss of centralized heating. The massive, Soviet-era district heating systems that pump hot water and steam into apartment blocks and offices rely entirely on electricity to power the pumps, the monitoring systems, and the local boosters. When the grid dies, the heat dies. And when the heat dies in -15-degree weather, survival becomes a minute-by-minute calculation. The immediate risks are massive. Hypothermia, particularly for the elderly, the sick, and infants. But the secondary risks are even more terrifying. Medical infrastructure failure is imminent. Hospitals rely on generators, but generators rely on fuel. And when 4.1 million people are demanding power, fuel delivery becomes chaotic and often impossible. Surgical suites, neonatal intensive care units, dialysis machines, all risk immediate shutdown or catastrophic operational failure. This is the true horror of the Russian strategy. They are not merely fighting the Ukrainian military. They are fighting the Ukrainian population using the environment as their deadliest weapon. This is the calculated weaponization of winter, transforming every apartment into a potential freezer, every city street into a gauntlet of exposure. The cold is no longer a backdrop to the war. It is the central theater of operations. The 4.1 million number is a staggering testament to the strategic success of the 87 penetrating drones. It proves that the attacks were effective not just in terms of voltage capacity lost, but in terms of human suffering maximized just as the grip of deep winter sets in. For Moscow, this is leverage. For Kyiv, this is a race against time, a desperate effort to stave off mass fatality caused by cold and darkness. The sheer scale of this humanitarian crisis immediately forces us to step back and ask, what is the long-term cost to the war effort itself? What is the assessment from the world watching this unfold? Fact 5. Strategic impact. The verdict from the outside. A high-ranking NATO official, speaking off the record to international media, provided the starkest assessment of the damage, stating that the attacks have crippled roughly 30% of Ukraine's remaining long-distance power transfer capacity. 30%. This is not 30% of the power generation capacity that existed at the start of the war. This is 30% of the remaining capacity. The systems that survived the previous year's strikes and were operating to keep the nation running. This figure points to an exponential increase in vulnerability. When you lose 30% of the last remaining infrastructure, the entire system is pushed past its breaking point. The NATO official emphasized the specificity of the targeting. The strikes hit the nodes and junctions designed for emergency resilience redundancy. This phrase is vital. Every modern power grid is built with backup plans, overlapping loops, and alternate routes to ensure that if one section fails, another can pick up the slack. This is redundancy. Russia didn't just target the main lines. They targeted the specific points, the nodes and junctions, that were supposed to allow the grid to route power around damaged areas. By crippling the redundancy systems, Russia has ensured that the next inevitable strike will cause exponentially worse damage, as there are no longer safe routing options left. This confirms the high level of Russian intelligence and their ruthless operational objective. Not to inconvenience Ukraine, but to fundamentally destabilize its ability to function as a modern state. Crippling 30% of the long-distance transfer capacity means that even if power can be generated locally, say, in western Ukraine, it now cannot be reliably moved across the country to the military logistics hubs, the industrial heartlands, or the most critical frontline support operations. The strategic consequence of this 30% loss is that it severely restricts Ukraine's ability to move war materials, operate sophisticated military command and control systems reliant on stable power, and maintain the industrial base necessary for repairing and sustaining its war machine. This is an attack designed to degrade the very foundation upon which the continued resistance rests. The NATO assessment implies a catastrophic success for Moscow. It acknowledges that the previous efforts to harden the grid, the deployment of expensive, custom-made protective structures, and the Western commitment of replacement equipment have been rendered inadequate by this single, sustained, massive operation. The war is now entering a phase where the enemy's ability to function is being methodically and successfully dismantled, piece by strategic piece. This level of damage is not fixed by patching wires. It requires time, massive resources, and crucially, a window of security that does not currently exist. And that brings us to the final, hardest fact, the timeline of suffering. Fact 6, restoration timeline. The long dark ahead. In response to the sheer volume and severity of the damage, the Kyiv City Council has initiated the rapid expansion of the Point of Invincibility efforts. Heated, fortified community centers where people can charge phones and find temporary relief. This is a stopgap measure, a recognition that the state cannot reliably provide basic services in the affected areas for the foreseeable future. The hard truth was delivered by DTK engineers, the backbone of the energy repair efforts. Their estimate for the full restoration of centralized heating and reliable power to the eastern districts of the capital, the areas most severely impacted, is brutally honest, between 14 and 20 days, 2 to 3 weeks. In the midst of a projected -15-degree deep freeze, the capital's eastern districts face up to 20 days of unreliable heat and power. This timeline is not an optimistic projection. It is a best-case scenario based on rapid deployment of repair teams working in incredibly dangerous, wartime conditions, often under the threat of secondary strikes. 20 days of dark, cold reality. 20 days of millions of people relying on wood stoves, blankets, emergency generators, and the thin hope of the points of invincibility to keep them alive. And this timeline is only for the restoration of basic, centralized services in Kyiv. It does not account for the 7 other oblasts hit by the 87 successful strikes. It does not account for the permanent loss of the 750 kV autotransformer at Darnitsia, which, again, will take months, if not a year, to replace. It is a local emergency measure against a nationwide catastrophic strategic failure. The 20-day window signifies the absolute maximum period of immediate, acute suffering that Kyiv must endure. It guarantees that the humanitarian crisis will deepen significantly before any meaningful recovery can begin. It is a chilling measure of the new strategic leverage Moscow has gained. They have inflicted a crippling wound that guarantees protracted suffering, forcing Ukraine and its Western partners to divert massive resources, military, financial, and logistical, away from the front lines and into an emergency civil defense effort. This escalation is not merely tactical. It is a fundamental shift in the nature of this conflict. Russia has committed to a campaign of attrition waged against the very stability of the nation, using cheap drones to achieve strategic results that conventional armies often fail to secure. They have successfully weaponized winter, turning the environment into an asset and civilian infrastructure into a liability for the defending forces. The story tonight is one of overwhelming scale met with surgical precision, resulting in a devastating operational penetration that has crippled resilience redundancy and ushered in a humanitarian crisis defined by cold and darkness. This moment is not just a page turning in real time. It is a moment when the structural integrity of Ukraine's defense against the winter has been deliberately, comprehensively shattered. The question now is not just when the lights will come back on, but what resources Ukraine and the West are prepared to deploy to fight a new front in this war. A front where survival is measured in insulation, fuel stockpiles, and the desperate, relentless battle against the cold itself. The long dark has begun, and the world watches to see if Ukraine can find the light switch before the frost claims its millions.